first two scenes of a short animation film, Father and Daughter, that we used in our two of our experiments. Just watch it as you would watch it normally, and after the scene you will get a small task. So we can start. Okay.
Problem is, I think I extended
Yeah,
the
there's-
screen. Okay.
That's fine. It's like this.
You know?
Okay. So it was the first two scenes of the movie, and in the following I would like to
Is that where you...
ask you. No, it doesn't.
I'm just looking over here.
I would like to ask you to describe the story of the two scenes that you have just seen in a few sentences. Just take a paper or take your computer and write down what you see. We will use these short descriptions later when we come to the data analysis, but now you got a little bit of an experience what the participants had to do during our experiment. It's a qualitative data collection. So put aside the description, save it, and let's talk about the unique form of this little animation film. I would like to guide your attention to the perceived physical distance from the character. What was it like? What do you remember? Yes?
There's a great distance to the characters. In fact, I would say there's only one shot that would qualify as a close-up, which is in fact an insert of a bicycle wheel. But it's not a. It's not a close-up of a character, but you call it an insert.
Exactly. Thank you very much. That was the main reason why we use this animation, because it keeps the physical distance from the character very far, and you will see how we manipulated this distance. How do we call, what is the filmic cinematic technique that regulates this distance? Shot scale, which is the perceived distance of the camera or of the viewer from the character. So that's one of the main concepts that we work with. And as I told you already, the scope or the main purpose of this whole project is to contribute the understanding of how formal non-content features influence social cognition processes in viewers. And the formal feature we are focusing on is shot scale, and the social cognition process, a process how we understand other people's mind, is the so-called theory of mind response. Maybe some of you is not familiar with the concept of theory of mind, so I would like to talk about it a little bit more in detail. So theory of mind is a very well-established concept in psychology, not that much in communication studies or media psychology, but in psychology the term reflects on the attribution to mental states to others and also to the self. In our study we concept on the other related theory of mind, and one of the reasons why theory of mind is important is because it helps us to understand other people's behavior in terms of mental states. So a famous picture, she's screaming, that's the behavior because she's frightened. Being afraid, experiencing fear is a mental state. So this helps the viewer to understand the observed behavior of the character, or in real life another person. Let me continue with the big frame of social cognition. Social cognition is an umbrella term for all the social cognition processes contributing to the understanding of other people's real or fictional others. And we can distinguish two main ways in theory how we understand others. One is representing the other people's mind, which is a cognitively driven process. It relates to the recognition of understanding of mental states, and theory of mind is one of the main processes having a role in this representation. The other role is more like an internally, viscerally driven process when we automatically bodily resonate to the other person's feelings. This route is often called as embodied simulation, emotional empathy, emotional contagion, motor mimicry. Research shows that the two routes relates to two different brain network and the interplay of the two. We assume will be experienced as an engagement with the character. Hopefully others will talk about the biological background of all this, but I would like to just pinpoint that what we are interested in is more the representing process and not the embodied simulation process. As I said, theory of mind is crucial in our everyday interpersonal relationship. Whenever we interact with another person, it's very crucial that we understand the content of the other person's minds, the feelings, thoughts, intentions, motivations. It contributes a lot to the quality of our relationships and to our cooperation with others. And in fiction or when we process a narrative, its theory of mind is crucial in building a mental model of the whole narrative. We need to understand the intentions of the character, the feelings, motivations of the character, and through this, theory of mind has an important role in narrative understanding. We need to understand why the character behaves in a certain way, and understanding the mental state underlying that behavior will help us in that. We also think that theory of mind channels our subjective engagement with characters, and as I said, together with the embodied simulation process, we experience a certain relation bond with fictional characters. So theory of mind is important both in real life and in processing of fictional narratives, and accumulating research has shown that processing fictional narratives actually improve theory of mind capability in real life. You might have read the Kitz and Castano article that was published in Science in 2013. With literary narratives, they found a causal relation between the two. However, they could not really identify what was the textual feature, what is it in the narratives that contributed to this improvement of theory of mind capability. And our aim is to tease the narrative apart formally and try to find good predictors of the theory of mind processing. You may ask why do we expect an effect of shot scale? How the two concepts relate each other? To understand our assumption, I need to refer to studies in neuropsychology, where they already identified that gaze, facial expression, gaze direction directly triggers theory of mind related brain areas. So whenever we see an eye movement, I look there, I look at Brandon, you will already or instantly infer to an intention on my side. I want to tell him something, or I want to show him something, or I have an intention. So we assume that shot scale, so the physical distance from the character, actually regulates the visual access to these social cognition related cues. The closer the character is, the more visual information you have that will trigger these brain areas. Previous studies have some evidence for this, also that shot scale increases arousal, that relates more to the embodied simulation part of social cognition. And a few isolated research showed that shot scale can enhance empathy and theory of mind. Do you want to add something?
No.
Do you have any questions so far? Because this was the brief theoretical introduction, so the two concepts, shot scale and theory of mind. And now I would like to continue with reflecting on our method to every step that we made. You may or may not agree with our decisions, but we just want to be open and transparent about everything that we have. So there are 6 research decisions that we identified when we were preparing for this talk. The first one wasn't a decision. We had to do an experiment because we wanted to establish a causal relationship, or we wanted to test a causal relationship between shot scale and theory of mind. But we needed to consider the media format, the method of manipulation, the research design, what to measure actually, and how to measure it. So I will go through these steps. So we used an experimental approach. There was no question about that. I know that many of you are familiar with the general design of an experimental research, but just let me flash it quickly, that when we do an experiment, we need predictor variables that are controlled and accurately manipulated. We need dependent variables that will be measured, and sometimes we consider a few moderator variables that will affect the relationship between the independent and the dependent variables. So in our study, it looked like this. So we had an audiovisual stimulus. We manipulated the formal feature of it, that's our independent variable, and we measured a response, a state, which was a theory of mind. And we did not really focus on traits in this time, but we could have introduced a few trait variables of the recipient, like trait empathy or trait capability of theory of mind, or any other personality features, demographics, gender, age, education. So this was the conceptual model we were working with. The second decision that we made was about the media format. When it comes to audiovisual narratives, you can choose at least 2 formats, using animation or using live action movies. In our case, it really matters, or you bring in many assumptions with either of the 2 decisions. We decided for animation because it allowed us to have a higher experimental control. However, we had to accept a few assumptions, namely that animation and live action movie, so when viewers watch animation and live action movie, actually they use similar psychological processes for theory of mind, so we can actually generalize our findings to live action movies. Or we can debate about this. There are some research comparing animation and live action movies and the viewer's reaction to the 2. What they found that identical brain regions are involved. However, the intensity of the response is higher when it comes to live action movies. The third decision that we had to make was about the method of manipulation of shot scale. I'm sure I'm stating the obvious, that when it comes to audiovisual narratives, to movies, it's very difficult to the technical part of manipulation, like when you work with written text. One way to manipulate shot scale, and we in the very first study we tried that, when you actually don't manipulate the material itself, but you involve many messages, many different movies, and you simply calculate an average shot scale to each of the movies as an aggregated value, and use this value as a predictor to the theory of mind response. In this case, you use, when it comes to statistics, a regression approach, and most of the time a within subject design, which means that every participant will watch all the movies, and after every movie you measure theory of mind. What do you think, what is the advantage of this method? So using more movies without actually manipulating the material.
Can you repeat the question? Are you asking whether we think it's important that you calculate an average value of shot scale versus a method that incorporates the fluctuations between shot scale? Is that the distinction you want us to?
Yeah, you don't know what else could you do. You're right. We contrast this method to technically manipulate, so to create movies for your experiment, compared to using already existing movies and not manipulating them. You wanted to
This is more ecological, but the movies are in other respects not comparable.
Yeah, exactly. The advantage of it, that it's more feasible, so when the researcher don't have any access to creative people, then it's feasible. However, there is another argument. Oftentimes when we present our manipulation, when we technically manipulated shot scale, the integrity of art, the issue of the integrity of art comes up, whether the researchers should be doing that or whether they should respect the integrity of art, and whether, yeah, that's it. One of the other advantages, like you said, that there are many other features may affect theory of mind. However, if you control or if you measure those other features as well, formal features, lighting, color, assign values to that, it allows you to explore the dynamics among these formal features. But as Catherine said, there can be potential confounding variables. Just to help you to understand, so maybe shot scale, you find a significant relation between shot scale and theory of mind, but maybe shot scale correlates with something else very highly. So whenever there is a close-up, there is a certain lighting or there is a certain color that may have an effect on theory of mind as well. And you need a higher number of movies, which will increase the number of participants, reimbursement money, and so on. So this is one way. In study 1, we did this. You will see how it worked out. And the other way, when you actually take one movie and systematically work on or create a shot scale, you take an existing movie and modify it, or you shoot your own movie. Then you have many different versions of the same film, which will come to not a regression approach but a factorial approach, and you will have a true experiment, which is always highly valued in an empirical field. Then you will need to work with a between subject design, which means that participant comes and she will be assigned only to one of the movies in a random way. What is the disadvantage of this? What do you think?
There's increased variability between people, so when you're not comparing them to themselves, you have to have more people to overcome.
Yes, exactly. So there will be difference in the trait, theory of mind, and in many other things, which is very difficult to control or to think of all of them. And other disadvantage, the feasibility. So you need to create movies for yourself, which can be difficult. And as I said, the ecological validity will come up, and you will have to defend or argue for your decision. The advantage of this method is the very high level of precision in the manipulation, and you can exclude the previously mentioned confounding formal features. We tried this in study 2 and study 3. Brandon will tell you how did we make it. So the fourth research decision that we had to make is actually which layer of the response to measure. When we think of a state or a response, we can differentiate at least 3 levels of a response: a phenomenological level, a psychological level, and the biological level. The phenomenological level reflects on the conscious, subjective experience about which the participant can report or can tell you something. The psychological layer, which reflects on the underlying psychological, cognitive, emotional processes that are observable for the researcher. And the biological layer is when you measure the physiological markers of certain psychological processes, and I think Matt will talk about this part, so I will not. We were interested mostly in the psychological layer, but some of our measures reflected on the phenomenological layer. Just a little bit of a detour about the phenomenological layer, which was less of our interest, but in communication and media psychology, most of the measures reflect on the phenomenological layer. However, the label is sometimes a bit misleading. So that's why Catherine asked me to talk about the narrative engagement scale a bit, so this will come now. The two most commonly used questionnaire to measure the phenomenological layer of engagement or of immersion is the transportation scale and the narrative engagement scale. Both measure an immersion-related state as a response to narrative structures. Narrative structure is an important keyword here, so when the stimuli is structured as a story format. Transportation scale was the first measure. It's a unidimensional scale. However, researchers try to group the items into certain response types, and mental imagery is the main process through which they conceptualize transportation, which is a metaphorical term to the Matt may help me to define transportation, to this shift to the narrative word that changes the traveler, and when she arrives back, she's aware of this change. Do you want to add something?
Yeah, that's pretty good. I'll talk about it more later too.
Okay.
But just the idea of devoting your cognitive and emotional processes to the story world and not the immediate world around you, and then how the viewer is changed as a result of that through either attitude, belief change, or different emotional memories.
Yeah, thank you. So, and I just want to remind you that this is a phenomenological, subjective conscious experience of the viewer, reader. Then came Buzel and Bilanjic scale, the narrative engagement scale. What they did, they collected all the existing available scale items into one study. They repeatedly made experiments with TV shows, so with very linear mainstream narrative structures, and through a factor analysis they identified the most important, most predictive items from 200 items, if I remember well. It's a multidimensional scale. It has 4 subdimensions. Focused attention, which is again doesn't measure the attention as a psychological process, but it measures the subjective experience of being focused on a narrative. Presence, which is the illusion of being there. It's an illusion of having a non-mediated experience, being unaware of the mediatedness of the story. narrative understanding, which is an important subscale in the engagement scale. It reflects on the viewer's perceived smoothness of understanding the narrative, how easy it was to follow the plot, whether I had difficulty or I lost the thread, these kind of items. Just a side note, through this subscale, Bizel and Bilanjic connects narrative engagement to flow, to the oldest concept of immersion from Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. They say that the smoother the process of understanding a narrative, the more flow will be experienced. So that gives this flow-like experience of reading or watching a narrative. Emotional engagement is the most important subscale for us because that reflects on the emotional engagement with the character, and this is the best predictor for other narrative effects. If you are familiar with Helena Bilanjic's work, she's not really interested in narrative engagement per se, but she's interested in narrative persuasion, so how story-consistent beliefs will occur after being exposed to a narrative, and she would like to identify these mediator experiences like narrative engagement that can predict the media effect after the narrative. So it's a state, it measures a state response. If you want to measure trait of narrative engagement, you need to find another scale. There are scales already developed named narrative engageability. Yes, so these two scales are responses to narrative structures, and just to mention other concepts that relate to non-narrative structures like flow and presence. And this is a huge difference between these concepts. Flow was originally developed to any kind of activity, from playing tennis to playing chess to cook, is when your skills and the challenge that you are faced with have a balance with each other, then you experience flow. In the original book, Csikszentmihalyi talks about reading, but it wasn't that important at that time. Presence, also an immersion-related concept. It was developed to measure or to describe the experience with virtual reality. As I said, it's very much the same as in the narrative engagement scale, the illusion of having a non-mediated experience with an object with a virtual reality. So as I said, emotional engagement is the most important subscale for us. I would just like to show you the 3 items that they used in the scale. The story affected me emotionally. During the program, when a main character succeeded, I felt happy, and when they suffered in some way, I felt sad. I felt sorry for some of the characters in the program. So you see that if we want to measure theory of mind as a phenomenological experience, we should approach these items or this direction. I have the feeling that theory of mind is already implied in these items. So for example, just to recognize that the character suffers, you need theory of mind functions, and just to feel compassion or pity for a character, you need to understand that something happened to the character that she didn't want it to happen to with herself. So we could not really use the emotional engagement subscale because theory of mind was really hidden in these items. And as I said, we were interested in the psychological layer of theory of mind. So let me continue with our way of measuring theory of mind. Maybe you've heard many tests and questionnaires reflecting on this psychological process. The main problem with them, from our perspective, is that they measure a trait and not a state response. So the famous reading the mind from the eyes, reading the mind from films and so on, from Baron Cohen, who researches autism spectrum disorder. They measure a trait, and we need to measure a state because we are interested in how an actual response occurs to a movie. So we needed to consider that, and we also needed to consider whether we want to use an unprompted or a prompted questionnaire. I step back one step. The questionnaires that we found for measuring theory of mind state were all quantitative questionnaires, and the problem with them was that they already, so the item itself already prompted theory of mind. Just an item asking the participant, what do you think the character felt in this scene, already prompts an assumption that the participant attributed a feeling of any kind to the character. So, based on previous research in attachment studies, we already know that many people has a zero level of theory of mind, so not the lack of attribution of mental states. So we really wanted to capture the variance in this regard. So we wanted to have a more sensitive measure to this. That's why I use the qualitative measure, so leaving the whole thing very open. And these are the 3 questions that our participants were given, always in this order. So first question, completed; second, completed; and third. You in our little experiment, you received the first instruction. Please describe the story of the film scene in as much detail as possible in at least 8-10 sentences. So we ask for a plot description. We don't refer to mental states or to characters whatsoever. You will see what happened. The second question prompts a little bit more. We wanted to see whether the instruction itself has an effect. Please try to imagine the story from the perspective of the female character. How would you describe her feelings, thoughts, and intentions? So you see it's prompting level 2. And we will not talk about this part of our study, but in a third question we asked, we collected data for the self-related theory of mind, our own emotional experience. So in total we had like 700 participants who wrote 700 times 2 little stories of the film, so you can imagine the volume of the textual data that we had. Luckily, both of us had very enthusiastic student assistants who helped us to code these little story descriptions. They were blind to the hypothesis and to the manipulation, to the main goal of the study. They just read the text, and they were given instructions to identify mental states in the answers. So at this point I would like to ask you to get back to your little story, because I will show you the code system that we used when we analyzed our data, and if you feel like you can code your own response following the code system that we developed. We coded for 3 big mental state groups: cognitive mental states, affective mental states, and intentions. As you see, and we counted in one of the variable was the frequency of the cognitive of these mental states. So cognitive mental state was any kind of memory functions, when they said that the little girl will never forget his father, she can't forget, she will always she will always remember him, and so on. Other mental functions like to accept, to imagine, to pay attention, to think, to notice, the level of knowledge, the lack of knowledge that the daughter had, to realize, to decide, to understand, to be certain, uncertain, to be convinced that the father will come back, and so on. Also, we coded under this category the references to arousal, to be tired, to be exhausted, and the references to the discrepancy of inner and outer world when someone lies, pretends, to fake. So that's our cognitive mental state category. Our affective mental state was any kind of reference to feelings. You would be surprised how difficult it is to define what a feeling is when we try to negotiate it with our students. But from sad, happy, disappointed, excited, afraid, have difficult feelings, anxious, worried, she's blaming herself, to suffer, and so on. So this was our affective mental state category. And we had the third one, frequency of intentions. Here, like, one of our study was conducted in Ireland, the other study was conducted in Germany, and the two language expresses intentions a little bit differently, but we tried to find a common ground, and whenever intention was expressed with an explicit word that she's determined, she makes an effort, she makes an attempt, or when the intention expressed by a preposition, in English it's to, or in order to, in order not to, so in German it's to, and so on. Intentions, and the third category, when intentions were expressed by modal verbs: have to, must, want, would like to, wish. Does anyone feel like to give a little bit of insight of his or her own codes? Like, could you identify all of these categories, or do you have something that doesn't fit to any of these mental state groups?
We noticed from coding that sometimes it can be easier to first identify that it's a mental state and then start to see if it fits into one of these codes as well. So if you're reading your own response, you might be able to just quickly pick out any mental states that you referred to and then see if you would fit into these.
Is there anybody who has no mental states attributed? It's not a problem, because you were assigned to the control condition, so you confirmed our expectations.
And I guess you only saw the first two scenes as
Yes.
well, so the narrative's only getting going.
But I realized that when I was writing it, that I sometimes was inclined to write something like that, but I was like, no, I should describe what happens. So I kind of thought that the task was not to go into assumptions, but to write what happened.
I guess what's helpful is that because everyone has that same maybe feeling or experience, and they're all in the same questions, that despite that, some people go against that and they still insert some intentions.
Okay. Other comments or? Yes?
I think for our experiment to be parallel, you should have phrased the question in the same way that you did in connection with the group of Irish and German recipients that you used, because I think that would have clarified maybe, I think I think words matter a great deal.
Yeah. I think I tried to use the same instruction, or that was my intention at least, to say that please describe what you've just seen.
You said 2 scenes, for instance, and it's not a scene actually. It's a scene, and then it's the first 2 shots of a sequence that we see. So you
Okay.
actually call it an extract would be the
Yeah.
correct term.
Sorry, I completely
And there was no
confused
mention
you.
of 8 to 10 sentences, which I thought was kind of interesting. I'd like to hear your thoughts about that, maybe later on, why you actually decided on a
Yeah,
length of reply, why that was significant.
We wanted to encourage participants to give a detailed description, because you may, so we worked with university students mostly, so just like between 2 classes writing 3 sentences, that's not enough for the analysis. So we wanted to give a prompt on that side, and nevertheless we excluded participants who gave like very short, under 10, shorter than 10 words. Yes?
I think that certainly my description, a lot of the things which are in your questions were certainly behind. And I wonder how much the context of where we are now affects what we actually, how we respond, because I think that's a lot of it.
Yes, certainly. So our participants were not aware of the
No.
of the context.
Just a comment. I mean, I've seen this movie before, and now I just wrote the facts about the scenes that you told me, but actually when I tried to remember what happened in the rest of the film, I basically only remembered the mental states, even though I only saw what actually happened. So I guess that also confirms it.
Yes. And just remind you of the main research question of ours. We would like to see how the visualization of the character affects the frequency and complexity of mental states in these descriptions. This description, I assume, reflects on, in one way or another, to the mental representations that you have about the story, which from other theories we know are constituted of the actions of the character and the intentions of the character. So we try to find a way to capture this mental representation and how mental states are placed in it. So this is the frequency of mental states, and you may argue that frequency does not really tell too much about what actually happens. That's why we introduced maybe a more informative variable, which is the complexity of mental states. We took these descriptions, and on a global rating scale, we rated the complexity of theory of mind. This rating scale is borrowed, sorry I don't have any references on this slide, but if you're interested in any of the literature, just let me know and I will send it to you. But this rating scale is based on Main's rating scale for reflective functioning. She works with in the frame of attachment and mentalization of borderline patients, and she conducts interviews with patients, and then about their family relationship, about their life narratives, and then they rate the complexity, how the participant perceives the interpersonal field surrounding him or her. So we adapted that rating scale to our analysis, and we use the 5-point rating scale that differentiates the absence of theory of mind when there is no mental state reference whatsoever, the low complexity of theory of mind when there are mental states, but they only refer to very ordinary mental states like hope and sadness, that were the 2 usual, but no mixed emotions and no reflection on the relation of the characters. There is the ordinary theory of mind that goes beyond the usual mental state references and can show the awareness that the mental states affect each other, so the mental state of the father affects the mental state of the daughter. Marked theory of mind, sorry I deleted the subscales, but it puts the whole mental state, it reflects on the changes of mental states, the ambiguity of mental states, that they are connected to each other and they may not reflect the reality. Full complexity of theory of mind, 3 participants fell into this category, so we could not really, we consider merge the 2 rating scale. We coded full complexity when the description gets more personal and more meaningful, and demonstrate awareness of all the mental states of all the characters. Unfortunately, we haven't finished the analysis of this part of the study, so we will only give you results about the frequency, and now it's Brendan's turn to introduce the findings and the outcomes.
How are we doing for time? We're okay? I'll, yeah, so like Katalin said at the start, it might seem like I'm gonna go back over some of this, but only by way of a reminder, so that to help you understand the results as I present them. So all these decisions we made then were translated into 3 studies. There's a lot of information up here. I'll just try and guide you through it really quickly. Study 1 was the Hungarian sample, then the Irish sample, and then the German sample. I'll refer to them by those numbers. And the thing that distinguishes the 3 studies is really in this area here. So in the first study, it was an analysis of the average shot scale distribution of 4 pre-existing films. And I'll present the results for that in a second. And then study 2 is a little bit larger, and these 2 were study 2 and 3 were this experimental manipulation. So in study 2, we had these different conditions, and I'll talk a little bit about that. We developed these stimuli and we inserted them into the pre-existing film. So as to just test the kind of the effect of inserting a close-up or manipulating the shot scale in a small portion of the film. And then study 3 was the whole film, and we were manipulating the number of close-ups that were inserted. And I'll remind you about that again in a while. The other thing just to say is there was slightly different outcome measures. So in the first study we just looked at the frequency of mental states, whereas in study 2 and 3 we were able to subdivide these kind of references into whether they were referring to affective, cognitive or intention, and whether they were towards the female character or the male character in the film. If you saw the whole film, you'll know the male character doesn't play a strong part of the narrative, and it didn't feature in our manipulation, so it kind of served as a control condition. So we wouldn't expect a lot of theory of mind towards the male character, and then we were able to go for complexity. Okay, so I'll just present you with the results of these quickly. Then study 1 is these 4 pre-existing films where in order to identify the distribution of the shot scale, a lot of films were looked at and narrowed down to these as good examples. They were matched in various features. For example, none of them included dialogue, and they were all animations. Father and daughter is exclusively in long shots or extreme long shots, very long shots or extreme long shots, whereas Letting Go, it featured a lot more close-ups. And so in that first study we were able to measure people's theory of mind responses. So I'm going to try and talk you through this really quickly. You can think of this graph. On the left here is the higher frequency of references to mental states of the participants. So higher numbers on the left is more theory of mind, and lower is less theory of mind. And then the film are kind of presented in terms of their shot scale distribution. So Father and Daughter is at the end there, which has no long shot or no close-ups, and Letting Go is all the close-ups. And so statistical analysis observed a significant linear relationship between those, and it was positive. Therefore, that means the more close-ups that were in the film, the higher the frequency of mental state references that we observed in participants' responses.
For the average shot scale, not
for the average shot scale of the films. The other important thing to say there is as Katalin discussed earlier, that there's potential problems with this study because there's potential confounding in there, and so you have these other ways that the films differ. And so when observing this finding, we were eager then to try and build on this and complement it with study 2 and study 3. So that's where we took father and daughter. We thought there's no close-ups in this. What if we work with some animators and experimentally insert these kind of bespoke close-ups? So I'll just say briefly a little bit about that process. If you haven't seen the whole film, I think it's quite structured and beyond from what you just saw earlier. The film follows the little girl as she grows up and she returns to the same place where her father left. And there are these points in the film where there are these point of view shots that were calling out for a close-up. So we were able to work with these animators in the Dunleary Institute of Art, Design and Technology, and they were working with the film and with us, and I guess there was this kind of merging of us calling for this experimental control and them trying to preserve the magic of the film while we tried to destroy it. And then working with them, we were able to create different versions of this film. So we were able to insert these close-ups. I'll give you a better example now at these different points. And we should say then, once we had this, we could make all sorts of versions of the film. A film with 1 close-up, a film with 10 close-ups. And these are all the neutral expression, and I can't see it, but we were able to also manipulate the facial expression on the close-up's face. And then we kind of pilot test those with participants, and we ask them, how would you rate the emotion the character is experiencing, and so on. So now we've kind of 3 versions of the film: this original with no close-ups, and then these 2 with either a sad or a neutral expression. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about study 2 and 3 and the results. But just to say before I start that there were no effects observed for responses towards the male character, and that should makes sense then. We're inserting these close-ups of this female character. So I'm going to focus on the results I'm presenting are about, when I talk about frequency of mental states references, I'm talking about references to the female character. Okay, so we saw this already. I'm going to focus on study 1. Remember, that was just the same scene you saw earlier, except we either inserted these sad close-ups or these neutral expression close-ups, or you saw the same one that you saw earlier. Okay, so the results then. The question was, did this manipulation affect the unprompted theory of mind for the female character? So that's referring to that question where we just say describe the story. I'm calling that one the unprompted one. And yes, our results showed that for the sad close-up condition, if you were assigned to that condition where there was a sad close-up, then this increased the frequency of theory of mind compared to the other conditions, the neutral or the long shot. And we were interested in exploring this a little bit more because remember we subdivided those mental state references into affective, cognitive or intention. So when we looked at how this broke down, we were able to see that this was largely driven by affective mental states. So specifically when participants saw the sad close-up, it increased, or relative to the other conditions, there were more affective mental states. They described the characters sad or lonely or so on, but no effect for cognitive or intention. But this, we thought this was interesting, and this was more kind of weight to the idea that these different references or different types of theory of mind could respond differently. And so we were particularly interested then in study 3, where remember this one was where they saw the entire film and they were assigned to a condition that was either the original or 1 close-up, 2, 3, 4, 5 or 10 close-ups. So they were assigned to one of these conditions and then they went through the task. Okay, so I'm going to... So yeah, what I'm going to show you here is just we've graphed the results to have a bit of a quick discussion around what we observed, and I'll try and point out some of the more interesting findings from the graph now. Okay, so I'll talk you through this. Again, similarly to the other graph I showed you, on the left we have a kind of a relative measure of theory of mind. So it's the mean theory of mind responses, and the numbers are kind of relative to the word count. So if you wrote more, you're more likely to make a mental state reference, and so we were able to account for that in our statistical analysis. And then the bottom was the condition that you were assigned to. So you're either in the 0 group, which is no close-ups, or 2, 3, 4, 5, and 10. The green lines are error bars. I think they're confidence intervals to just represent our kind of level of confidence in how much that mean represents the population. And then at the top left we have the different kind of the key for the different lines. So the light blue version is the affective mental states, the red one is the cognitive mental states, and then the darker blue one is intention. And so remember, in the first study we pointed out that there was this positive relationship, that the more close-ups you see, the more you will make theory of mind references. But in this study, the statistical analysis identified a negative relationship, which intuitively, without looking at the graph, it seems like it's the very opposite result. But in fact, when we look to the graph for the cognitive responses, we can see that it's a little bit more complex than just a linear relationship. In fact, it appears as though it's a positive relationship to a point, this tipping point, beyond which then it looks like there's a negative relationship between the number of close-ups and theory of mind responses. So participants in the 10 close-up condition had much lower theory of mind than, for example, in the 3 close-up condition. And that was a significant effect for the cognitive mental states. We were also able to compare within these conditions, along the bottom, we were able to compare the amount of theory of mind responses that were either affective, cognitive, or intention. And we found no difference between the conditions, with the exception of 2 close-ups and 10 close-ups. So at the 2 close-up condition, it looked as though affective theory of mind was significantly higher than the other types. And the same effect was observed in the 10 close-up condition. Is there any more on those graphs before I move on to the last one?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to see in comparison the
Yeah.
two graphs.
So yeah, like the question earlier was around how there was that mismatch between the question we used for the participants and maybe the task that we asked you to do, and that's part of our point that we're trying to make, is that the questions that we ask participants are really important, especially for a workshop on how we measure these things. Because what I've graphed in the next graph here is, I'll just get back actually, this is the unprompted, just describe the story responses. But if we looked at question 2, the prompted response, where we say, please take the perspective of the female character, what we notice about the responses is that the effect disappears, and that relatively that some of the scores are higher, so people are more likely to report theory of mind. But in general, they follow all this same pattern. That effective theory of mind responses were highest, followed by cognitive and then intention. Sorry, that key is a little bit off. You can move it down with your mind. And the point is that when we're prompting these theory of mind responses, these complex effects seem to disappear, or the complex effects of at least of close-up seem to disappear. We're happy to discuss these, of course, a little bit more, and I'm sure you may have questions, but what I thought I would do is try and take together some of these findings into some sort of take-home messages for now. And that what we're arguing here is that the relationship between shot scale and theory of mind is positive and linear to a point. For example, in our research, it looked like around 2 or 3 close-ups, and then beyond which then the effects are negative. The other thing was to say that theory of mind, of whether we're modelling the participants' emotions, their thoughts, or their intentions, may have different sensitivities to this sort of manipulation. And specifically then, this is important for the measures, that we need to carefully consider kind of the way we're measuring theory of mind, and those sorts of questions, the way they're worded. As we said, words matter. And if a researcher was to focus on any particular single type of theory of mind, like affective, cognitive, or they would have very different results than this kind of the varied, complex relationships that we show. And then just by way of wrapping up, I'll give you a sense of our future plans. After you heard about us using all these complex coding frames, then in the middle of that process we discovered Luke, which is this linguistic inquiry, and word count, which is a software that does it all for you. But of course that would be amazing if that was the case, but as you know, with any sort of automated analysis process, it's actually really useful that we have our manually coded version, and we can explore the validity of these automated versions as well. We want to test it with more stories. If anyone has seen our research over the past couple of years, you know that we've been talking about this study, and we're really interested to start building this beyond the specific story we've been looking at as well. And we want to manipulate other formal features. I'm sure you could already consider various other formal features in films that might change the way in which we think about characters. We're interested in incorporating physiological measures so that we complete that triangle that Katalin presented earlier on. And we see this as part of a broader research contribution, whereby if we can start to establish some of these formal features that can be specifically used to change state theory of mind, then perhaps very useful tools can be developed for people who have particularly vulnerabilities or disabilities around their social cognition, and that these sorts of tools can be created that are not just beneficial but also quite engaging or useful. Okay, so yeah, that's our presentation.